everyone, I'm Mike Ward and welcome to Conversations in Healthcare, a video series brought to you by DRG, part of Clarivate. This episode is one of a number that we've been recording that looks at the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic is having on the healthcare ecosystem. In line with this, I'm delighted to be joined by my DRG colleagues, Steve Edgar and Judith Rubinstein. They're both going to offer insights on how the pandemic is actually impacting patient access to treatments. So Steve is a senior manager in the Global Market Access team and is based in Toronto. And Judith is senior director data at Context Matters market access platform, and she's based in New York. So Steve and Judith, I hope you're both well, and those you care about are also keeping safe. Thanks very much for joining me today.
Appreciate it, Cindy.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
So we're all aware of the devastating impact that the pandemic is actually having, the appalling death toll that has affected hundreds of thousands of families, and the disruption for people to get treatment, not just for COVID-19, but all other diseases and conditions. So from your research, what have been the most important issues that actually have impacted access to medicines and treatment?
Well, I can jump in there. I think it's been really interesting because it's such a rapidly developing situation, obviously. So you don't have any of the usual tools. It's sort of relying on mechanisms that are in place for, there's emergency tools in place, obviously, but for the most part, that access to medicines is something that's done, very cautiously and carefully. So in this case, I think what we're seeing in terms of the larger health landscape is essentially 5 key themes that governments are responding with. So I think, first of all, it's just containing the scope of the problem, obviously. So testing and tracing, and just trying to come up with sort of novel methods to make sure that we're actually mitigating the impact of the actual virus spread. But then you really get to the supply chain and how are you actually supplying the drugs that are needed, the treatments that need to be provided in order to tackle the problem. But then, of course, you have to look at, well, how are you assessing treatments? Obviously, if we have new treatments, it's a novel virus. We have to look at sort of assessing, what can we do to sort of tackle this, maybe relying on old therapies, maybe relying on new, and then how do we go about assessing them? And then how do we speed the access to those medicines? Because obviously the sort of traditional pathways are a little slow for the context we're in right now. And then, of course, you have to look at how do you pay for those treatments? How do you surge resources to healthcare systems to make sure that people have access to care when we actually have those treatments available? So it's really sort of along that continuum, I think, that we're seeing essentially the response. And because with the novelty of this, like I said, the speed of it, you can't really rely on traditional sort of developing policies, rigorous review. It's much more of a all hands on deck, which I think we're all finding in all sort of instances in life right now. But it's sort of looking throughout the continuum at the different elements of the supply chain, right from development right through to access.
Yeah, so highlighting 5 key issues there. I think what we'll do is we'll look at them, one at a time. So we'll get a little bit granular. So I guess one of the issues that you talked about was the supply chain issue, and this is something that we were all aware of because just in terms of PPE equipment, ventilators, etc. There was a sort of challenge around that, and then there was concerns about whether or not people were going to get access to active pharmaceutical ingredients, etc. So what actually are the major challenges around that supply chain disruption, and what is being done to either at least minimize it, if not actually prevent shortages of drugs or key components of patient care?
Yeah, well, I think thankfully a lot of the early concerns haven't borne out in terms of severe shortages. Obviously they have with personal protective equipment. With medicines, supply lines have held up aside from some exceptions, but for the most part, some of the really early concerns obviously were as countries looked like maybe they were jockeying for position in terms of imports. There were some real concerns about export bans. I know in India, there was some API, initially some restrictions on exports. So there were some concerns there. I think governments have sort of come together, and there's certainly some authorization barriers in terms of going through different processes. But for the most part, we have seen those products moving. But at the same time, there's obviously concerns about running out of existing stocks of drugs. So the main thing we've seen is really a lot of government involvement, a little more heavy-handed, obviously, than in the past. So a lot of mandatory orders to inventory stocks. Some governments have granted themselves the authority to compel companies to prioritize production of essential medicines. Haven't seen that be something that's been put into practice, but certainly, like I know in Spain, they've given themselves that authority. Certainly, inventorying being on top of all the essential medicines. And then also sort of trying to build up centralized stocks as they already have them in place. And then you've also seen a lot of orders sort of preventing stockpiling by individual firms. So a lot of, and I think this is a theme you'll see throughout this discussion, but a lot of sort of centralizing a bit and just sort of making sure to consider the wider scope of the problem, whereas in the past maybe it would have been a little more decentralized. So that's one of the sort of the initial sort of triage, I think, to resolving the dilemma here with worrying about drug shortages.
Right. And is there anything though that, say, for example, the industry or sort of your companies, can be doing to ease that potential strain?
Yeah, I think so. Like, they don't necessarily need to wait for government action. Like, I know in Japan, for example, one thing I've been monitoring that's really interesting is the industry association has sort of come together, coordinating across different companies, providing self-checklists for COVID supply, and then having processes in place for should they have shortages or should they identify any shortage. And of course, there aren't that many COVID-19 therapies we found that are that effective, but we're really talking about concerns about just moving other therapies around, essential drugs. And I think the coordination there, having a tool in place to say, okay, well, we know who has this stock, we're centralizing this within the industry. So voluntary measures like that, sort of coordinating so they have some kind of way to act, effectively. And I think also on that line, now more from the government perspective, but you're seeing a little bit more centralized procurement as well. So whereas it would have been more direct purchasing, whereas there would have been in the past, maybe going out to bids and more decentralized across facilities, just a little bit more sort of doing that at the central level. So I think firms can really be active in engaging with decision makers there, and sort of keeping them aware of where they're at in terms of their stock and supply. And then again, coordination is going to be key. So regional coordination, we're seeing some of that. So I know the EMA, which you'll probably see throughout, most of the responses, that's been they've jumped out in front on a lot of these issues in terms of regional coordination. But yeah, just sort of that kind of siloed approach really isn't going to be an effective response, obviously, to the scale of the crisis here.
Yeah. And I guess that there have been sort of questions about how prepared everybody was for the pandemic, because in the past there had been sort of stockpiling when there was concerns around a potential flu pandemic, etc. Do you think that this, in a post-pandemic world, there would be a different sort of level of preparedness on behalf of governments in terms of making sure that they've got those strategic stockpiles of essential equipment and medicines?
Yeah, I think so. I think one thing that could be really interesting and have sort of a lasting impact is this sort of push to localize supply chains. So you are seeing some of that. Like, as I mentioned, even with supply lines holding up in certain respects, obviously there's concerns because, heavy reliance on China and India. I think 80% of, a lot of markets I've been looking at, they're relying obviously for their active pharmaceutical ingredients from those markets. So there's just general concerns. So I think that will probably have a lasting impact. I know we've seen Sanofi in France is looking to become, I think, the second largest API manufacturer with a local Europe effort. In Germany, government has been very vocal, but we're sort of pushing for a more European-based supply chain. And I think the most interesting one I've seen actually is in Japan. They've actually paid financial incentives to companies to move outside of China in particular, but just to move into Japan or to other markets, just either whether to localize or to at least diversify supply chains. So I think that will be really interesting to watch. Obviously, that has implications for pricing. Obviously, there's reasons that things have been set up sort of the way they are in terms of global interconnectedness. So I think I think you will see more movement on that front, but then the question is, how efficient will that be? And if we have this diverse supply chain, what will it mean for sort of how smoothly we're used to things operating in terms of centralized sourcing and whatnot?
Yeah, in fact, in conversations I had with both Joe Panetta, who's the CEO and president of Biocom, the Californian biocluster, and Bob Coughlin at MassBio, which again is the epicenter for sort of the biotech world in Massachusetts. They both said that they anticipated that companies would at least geographically diversify their supply chains, and some of those supply chains would be a lot shorter. So it isn't just something that's happening in Europe and Asia, it's also happening in the US. One of the other issues you talked about, and this is almost like a political hot potato, certainly here in Europe, and that's around the surveillance, the sort of the tracking and the tracing. What are the challenges have you seen around this sort of the establishment of robust systems that actually can be complementary across international borders?
Yeah, I think there's a number of challenges. I think you hit on the key there, which is coordinating across borders or even within borders. I mean, we've had I know in Canada where I'm based, even where there is a good infrastructure in terms of sort of a strong capacity in terms of leveraging patient data and sort of epidemiological forecasting, things like that, we're having trouble sort of coordinating and sharing that data effectively. So I think given we're seeing that in decentralized jurisdictions, even nationally, that internationally, it's a real challenge. I mean, we're seeing, again, the EMA, we're seeing agencies come together to try to coordinate on this. But really, the question is, I think it's twofold. It's, do you have the data capacity in place? So like I know, for example, Austria has done, in Germany, for example, I think the UK also has made some movement here in terms of, aggregated, anonymized patient data, being able to draw on that, to track the disease spread. But again, to be able to provide sort of that real-time insight, you need to there's a lot of elements that come into play that make it a little trickier. So for example, you see a lot of partnering with big tech and big data, sort of leverage that effectively, looking at claims data. But of course, you run into a lot of privacy issues. So I think one of the lasting things here will be a proliferation of more of the sort of data privacy regimes. But again, those haven't really been tested on this sort of scale, I don't think. And then of course, when you get into the contact tracing, things like that, obviously there's apps. South Korea has done one. The UK obviously is rolling out their test and trace initiative. And so I think you'll see a lot of that sort of continued concerns. So how do you balance the effectiveness of sort of the patient data? Now it is anonymized, aggregated, but there's obviously concerns nonetheless. Like I know in India, for example, they have a biometric database for a previous health system they rolled out, and there's been some state governments have released some of that data in terms of who's infected. So I mean, obviously, I think it goes to developing up that capacity, the technical capacity, the expertise in terms of managing this data, and then really sharing it. Can you effectively share it? Because can these decision makers talk to one another? Because like I said, even in Canada, we have one of the more sophisticated EHR capacities. We're not in EHR, but in terms of patient data monitoring, they're not really sharing across decision makers that effectively. I think that's been a struggle. So I think you'll see probably more of that, again, more of that centralized, a little more involvement centrally, or like you said, regionally, sort of supranationally, sort of people just jumping in to say, okay, we need to have some sort of tool to be able to monitor this, leverage this data across borders, because the disease isn't going to know borders. Obviously, it's just not as effective on that scale.
I mean, have there been any sort of good examples of best practice that could actually become the sort of the basis of a more cohesive surveillance system, transnational surveillance system?
I think transnationally, it's a struggle at the moment. Like I think you're seeing more individual regions. I think Europe is probably the lead there. Like I mentioned, Austria has been very effective at sort of drawing on the patient data. They already have sort of the surveys in place. They have their social insurance system. They're well positioned, sort of draw on electronic health records. and other sort of medical research to provide insight into the treatment needs. But I think internationally, I mean, you are seeing more and more of that coordination. I think it's early on. So I think it remains to be seen from my perspective. I think there is obviously some movement, but it's one of those things where like I'm skeptical a little bit of how effectively governments will be able to share and sort of leverage this data. Obviously, they're going to have to. So we're going to have to see sort of how effectively can you just put these new measures into place. But it's one of those things where governments have trouble cooperating in the best of times. So it'll be interesting to see, how can they really roll that forward into something, especially when it could be so volatile in terms of privacy concerns. I mean, that's not something that's going to be at the forefront when people are dealing with the pandemic, but it's going to be something of lasting significance to a lot of people, obviously, as things hopefully calm down in the future a little bit.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, again, there's one thing having the data and being able to collect it, but then it's actually knowing, what you can actually do with that data, because we don't really understand everything we need to know about COVID-19 and the way it's transmitted, etc. So that clearly there are still a whole bunch of challenges around that. Around sort of the whole sort of clinical development space, clinical development, approval, launch of new medicines and vaccines usually takes years to complete. Given the rapid pace in which this pandemic is spreading, what have you seen? What is being done to sort of increase the velocity in delivering COVID-19 diagnostics and treatments?
Yeah, it's been very interesting. So that's an area where there are policies in place traditionally, and I think we will see more of those. So priority review pathways. So where essentially you have, if it's a life-threatening condition, there's an absence of alternatives. Perhaps it's first in market. There's ways to sort of streamline the process of approval, and we're seeing a real growth in those over the last few years. It's something we've been tracking, and they've had market success, really, those pathways. But again, they're not. That is sort of assuming a much less rapid sort of development in this. So what we're seeing instead of reliance on those as much is more on emergency access, compassionate use programs where you have sort of a very limited patient population. And I know we've been sort of tracking that with some of these emerging therapies. So relying on these, these sort of emergency mechanisms. But again, I think in the future, there'll be more of the sort of the priority review where it's a little more standardized. I mean, these programs are, but they're more of a short-term sort of solution. So that's an area where I think we'll see probably a little bit more cementing or developing of those priority sort of expedited review pathways. And what that means is sort of what we're starting to see already, where the data requirements aren't as stringent necessarily early. There's potential for sort of post follow-up. And then even right from the beginning, we're seeing sort of, accelerated research pathways, for example. So whereas even just in terms of, the research ethics approvals, if there's, say, for example, there could be parallel review. So say there's multiple reviewers are required to go through various procedures, which is all too common in research. We're seeing some parallel reviews. Certainly timelines have been sort of massively expedited. So if there's, governments or I know the EMA, NICE, and UK, they're trying to get out ahead of this and sort of put out guidelines of what they're looking for. But they're certainly streamlining most of those processes where things could take months, they're taking days, approving clinical trials much more quickly, and sort of just try to move these things along as quickly as possible and sort of have one foot into the next step of the process at a quicker pace than they would have in the past. So yeah, you're definitely seeing a lot of movement there. And I think, like I said, these emergency use exemptions, compassionate use, I think will be, early access to medicines in the UK. Like you'll see those schemes, I think, cemented a little bit more as a result of this. So that's certainly an interesting area to watch. But again, they've definitely, sped up. I'd say pretty much all the timelines at every stage of it, which is very interesting, like bioequivalence testing, just the various sort of elements that will go into it, because it's quite a long, drawn-out process normally, and we're just seeing that expedited. I think, interestingly, from every step of the way, whereas in the past, it might be from one particular element, and that would take years to develop, and now it's just happening within months.
I mean, in conversations I've had with, CEOs of biotechs and pharmaceutical companies, that's exactly what they're saying, is that, sort of the decision processes that would have taken months have been concertinaed into days. And it's kind of interesting that actually maybe this is something in a post-pandemic world, maybe we don't actually have to have such elongated processes, that we can actually sort of, this velocity or speed that we've created, we could do something about. But of course, then it comes back to having good surveillance systems, because of course, you want to then sort of still be able to track the patients when if they're on these drugs that have been approved in these sort of rapid processes. What about, however, treatments or sort of regulatory processes involving treatments or diagnostics that aren't actually COVID-19 focused? Are we seeing any evidence that there is a slowing down of regulatory processes and approvals for sort of non-COVID conditions? And if so, what should companies be doing to sort of minimize that situation?
So for regulatory approvals, we're not really seeing a slowdown, just because they are a longer pathway of time. So in terms of the clinical trials that are in process, there is some evidence that recruiting for them has slowed down, but there's not a ton of evidence that there will be an additional add-on of many months to the approval process, although we do know that in the March timeframe in certain countries, there was an immediate delay. So there might be a delay of a couple of months of bringing things directly to market, but it doesn't look like overall that this is going to be something that sets us back in terms of research in years or even many months.
Right. You're in the work that you do, you have a lot of visibility on what's going on sort of in that health technology assessment space. How is the pandemic actually impacting or disrupting either sort of current assessments or the initiation of new ones? Because most of these HTAs actually take place when the products are close to approval or they've been approved. So are we seeing any disruption on HTA and assessments?
So on that front, we are seeing some significant disruption. Some countries like South Korea have effectively stopped their HTA production. Some countries like France have created a much more streamlined process for it. And in general, HTA production has gone way down, and it's hard to see what the uptake of new HTA is, but it looks like there is some evidence that in the May timeframe, some countries, particularly in Europe, were trying to catch up on some of that, so that there isn't a long-term delay, but we're not sure if that trend will continue, or if HTA production will be much further down. And there is also some concern around what the decisions will be from these HTA bodies and whether or not they will be able to approve drugs at the same rates as they have in the past, if they're going to have to reevaluate their thresholds. There's some evidence that outside of COVID-19, there might be need to cut spending in healthcare because of lack of money. But there is also some evidence that within COVID-19, they're looking at some more creative pricing models. So not just looking at cost effectiveness analysis or cost utility analysis, but looking at some cost recovery models. So that would be something, actually in the United States, for remdesivir, the agency ICER proposed a cost recovery model and of $10 for a 10-day course of treatment, or if the course of treatment was 5 days, it would be a $5 cost recovery model for the company, and that would be a very different type of pricing for that kind of treatment.
Okay, so there's some sort of innovative thinking around almost like the sort of the models that the people are using, and presumably this could be used for other areas, like for example antimicrobial resistance, where again it's really difficult to sort of price in sort of or to come up with a price for the value of the drug. So when sort of looking at sort of the HTAs, then you're saying that, well, there may have been some sort of drop off, but it looks like they're sort of beginning to pick up pace, certainly in Europe. That might be the case, and that there is also going to be potentially a sort of a readjustment in the terms of sort of the models. You also sort of hinted though that there might be, because of the sheer cost of the to the economies of the pandemic, that there may be a sort of a rethinking about what cost effective looks like. Does that mean that there would be potentially sort of a lowering of those thresholds of where something is deemed to be cost effective or not?
So no one's talking specifically about that. There has been no official data on that front, but there is a lot of evidence that countries are running close to what their healthcare budgets might be for the whole year, and we are only half. Yeah.
So, okay, and actually, sort of, I mean, this brings us nicely into sort of, how sort of various health systems across the globe have actually, responded to the pandemic, because we've seen sort of different ways they've done it. Do we have sort of, any sort of sense of some of the sort of the initiatives that have been introduced actually might be sustained, once the sort of the crisis begins to abate?
Yeah, I think we've seen obviously a lot of public investment in vaccine research and development. I think something that'll be really important is to continue, especially in a cost-constrained environment, which it will be obviously as the economic fallout starts to take hold, to continue, I think, advocating for that funding, if not just for this crisis, to prepare for the next. So I think, for example, I'm seeing a lot of there's innovation superclusters in Canada. I'm seeing a lot of interesting public-private collaboration. So I think those mechanisms, now that they're being designed, should hopefully be something we can leverage in the future. But you have to wonder, how much is the funding going to dry up? And I think that's obviously industry, certainly patient groups will have a lot of an advocacy role there to play, for sure. I think as of right now, what we're seeing health systems do is just sort of surge resources to the front lines, try to expand access to care. And I think that lines up nicely with, there's been a lot of expansion of sort of universal insurance. I know we've been tracking that in Southeast Asia, for instance, places like Philippines, and where they're really trying to develop, their coverage all throughout the area. And you're seeing that sort of globally, where the countries that, if you have a higher out of pocket, obviously it's harder to sort of address the coverage in this case. So you're seeing the health system challenges that are always sort of been there, but it's put the extra sort of bit of strain there. And I think for that reason, there's really two sort of commonalities you're seeing in responses, sort of regardless of political stripes or the nature of the health system, which is we are seeing extension of health insurance benefit packages. So sort of temporary kind of packages to cover any associated treatments, and then a waiving of co-payments. So for diagnostics, any kind of associated treatment. So what's interesting is, as they find more effective ways to deliver care, to sort of deliver health services without this sort of some kind of encumbrances they've had in terms of lack of coordination. Some of these fee schedules I've been noticing are it's kind of Byzantine. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think they're basically streamlining everything. Similar with market authorization, we're seeing just sort of, okay, how do we cover these things in a holistic way. And I'm curious to see how much that lasts. Now, again, you're going to see cost containment, and that's sort of what you have to sort of watch out for, obviously, because governments across all sectors will be struggling sort of severely, likely, for at least in the short term, before there's any economic rebound. So to me, I think that points to where is the more, how can you sort of effectively leverage that that kind of a context into something positive for patients? And I think that's probably more efficient allocation of health resources. So that's something we are seeing already. So we mentioned digital health a little bit, but certainly telemedicine, more home care, just sort of, again, big data, leveraging that for, say, smartphone apps, and just sort of finding a way to, I thought, more effectively sort of leverage this, environment. That I don't think that there'll be the cost necessarily available for some of these sort of past practices. So I don't think they'll be able to put that genie back in the bottle. Some of these things where, like, I know payers have been really concerned about some of these ways of, online prescribing or telemedicine, and we have seen less resistance to that, which is really notable. I know in the US, there's been a lot of past resistance, and we're seeing insurance companies sort of pull back on that. But of course, the concern has always been overuse and arguments about fraud and whatnot. And I think looking ahead a bit, you'll probably see more development of sort of new monitoring mechanisms, sort of ways to sort of try to rein those concerns. Also do something about it.
Yeah, again, so conversations I've had with people, they've suggested, that their healthcare systems are going to be different, around things like, so telehealth, telemedicine, sort of where is in fact the best place to give patient care. And the fact that a lot of patients have now experienced that remote access or engagement with physicians, something that kind of got used to and actually recognize that it actually works. So therefore, there's not going to be much patient resistance to that shift. So I think we're going to see some changes there. I mean, do companies have to do something different? I mean, do they have to make different kinds of investment or change their behaviors to adapt to this, this potential new environment?
I think so. I mean, I think you need to obviously build up your information technology sort of capabilities. You need to be able to engage with decision makers on a new front that maybe in the past is something that you could sort of afford not to. If you were sort of already having success through established channels, I think you're going to have to address that. More business to consumer kind of model where, you're in terms of healthcare delivery. So like I know in China, for example, you talk about telemedicine, but a lot of these things where there's a question of sort of the infrastructure, right? So like I mentioned China just because I know there's been a lot of partnering there with local firms, technology firms, sort of working with health providers. So you're seeing more of that. I think companies need to be sort of reaching out, looking for opportunities like that if they don't have their own capacity, and just sort of also, I think just in general, and sort of going back to what Judith was talking about as well, but and this goes to HTA in general, but specifically now, obviously to focus on value. So in this cost contained environment, it'll be incredibly important to be able to demonstrate value. Obviously, right now, in terms of evidence evaluation, that's something that's sort of being sped along, or certain things have been sort of set aside for the moment. But obviously, as they start, getting back to evaluating all technologies and looking at what could sort of fill the new post-COVID landscape in terms of meeting therapeutic needs, you're going to want to be able to make that value proposition. It's going to be more important than ever, obviously, because there just won't be the resources available, I don't think, for anything that doesn't really make that case.
Yeah, I would say that this may push us even further towards a world where real world evidence is something that we're going to have to look at in a more comprehensive way, and that HTAs may be more open to, as a result of some of these drugs being approved or taken into account with these new programs that have developed around COVID-19. I think that there's probably going to be need to do more research into how they manage that. Are there more propensity score matching studies? Are there more ways of evaluating real world evidence to make that more more like a randomized control trial and more able to be compared to other trials.
Yeah. And of course, interesting, the sort of, the use of real world evidence, the sort of the shorter timelines. I mean, that's clearly going to affect the sort of the economics of R&D, which then will sort of, factor in, the cost of healthcare as well. So, you want to sort of see there are knock-on effects. So just finally, I'd just like to ask you about, so what lessons do you think, the world, can learn from this pandemic? Which behaviors will become that, that new normal, that are going to impact, the healthcare ecosystem, whether it's pharmaceutical companies, whether it's hospitals or health systems, or doctors or patients?
I think I think you touched on this a little bit earlier, but just from a regulatory perspective and right through the pricing and reimbursement, some of the duplicative processes, I think there is some streamlining. There's obviously streamlining that's happening out of necessity, but I think a lot of that is something we can look at. Keeping patient safety and sort of evidence at the forefront, there's still a lot of, processes that are just sort of, they've outlived their usefulness, or there's a way to sort of, like, for example, parallel review of, different stages in the drug approval process. I think those are things that, even to the supply chain level, those are things that it can probably, something we can learn from and carry that forward. And I mentioned priority review in general processes. Those aren't in every country. In some places you just don't have that opportunity outside of maybe an emergency exemption, to get drugs to products to patients that are really in need, and there's not really an alternative. And so I think we've seen some of that in recent years, but I would expect to see a lot more of that. What that means is policies like, if there's a domestic clinical trials required, maybe waiving that if it's not necessarily applicable in this case, if you can draw on, data that sort of can show some of the same evidence, and maybe you can have a post follow-up just to get drugs to patients and things like that. I think we can see, certainly in some of the developing markets as well, where those processes are a lot more bureaucratic. You've kind of learned from this, you can't really afford to have that in place, I don't think, all the time, because it doesn't really leave you well equipped to prepare for the next crisis, I would say.
Yeah, I'd say that the one that I think will be the most lasting will be the shortening of the time between initial molecule development and patient access. I think that however that happens, and that will probably look different in different places, but that's going to be the key piece that we retain beyond this, and that companies really and systems need to consider how to do that in the future.
Yeah, and I think also, so I was just going to say, in line with that, I think with this cost containment in those processes, like we talked about HTA, I think you'll see a lot more innovative contracting. We mentioned the earlier example there, and just sort of the cost recovery approach and how do you sort of price these technologies. But I think just going forward, you'll see a lot more managed entry and innovative contracting, just to sort of get treatments to patients to help speed that sort of that process in terms of trimming down those timelines, but also the affordability question. So there'll be a lot more, looking at how innovative ways to come up with pricing arrangements that can sort of benefit payers and manufacturers as well.
So great. Well, Steve, Judith, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us today. The insights that you shared will be of great interest to our audience. So if you'd like to tune into future conversations in healthcare, follow our LinkedIn page, where we'll be posting alerts for the future episode releases. In closing, I'd like to thank Steve and Judith again for joining us, and thank you for tuning in. Until next time, stay safe and healthy. I'm Mike Ward, and I'll see you in the next episode.